situations where this sort of computation won't work, and this is when the number of evidence is 0. And this is when we sampling, and when we hit a wall of sampling. It's called the zero probability problem. And zero probability problem happens more likely than you want it to be, because it is likely that our samples does not represent the population as best as we want it to be, because you can never really collect enough information to sort of cover the entire world. And I want to mention things about this zero probability problem. Usually what you would do with this zero probability problem is that you will manipulate your prior belief about the system, and therefore you sort of give a certain level of chance for all possible configuration to be existing and presented in your case. However, manipulating prior is a kind of a tricky bit. This effectively is that we're manipulating whatever conditional probability tables to make it, to sort of like engineer a different type of value in a system. And to sort of like understand the analogy of manipulating prior, just think of Germany, where the government is formed of many individual political parties. Some of these parties are very small and are not very representative to the entirety of the German population. But the government will reserve a small number of seats to ensure that people's voice of those parties represented will be heard. And this process of reserving a small number of seats is like what we're doing here by manipulating prior. This approach can introduce bias to the system, and it's just like reserving seats to the smaller parties can actually be controversial, and especially when the population regulations are being swayed by a small number of votes. So, in other words, manipulating prior actually introduced bias. And to sort of understand the zero probability problem, now the question will then become, okay, then how do we introduce as least amount of bias as possible? So, as I mentioned, the zero probability problem of manipulating prior is for us to basically do something with the conditional probability tables. And so in this slide here, you can see that we have all the conditional probability tables, and at the bottom bit is where we get the actual data. So let's say we get a pivot table between a person's BMI level and their age bracket. So in a way, we're looking at what is the frequency of a patient being aged between 15 and 60, and their BMI. I consider them as a sort of like in a normal weight situations like this. Frequency table. So this is our actual data set, and we can use different type of approaches to manipulate a prior. In the software package that I use is you can either use smoothing prior, or something called the BDEU prior, or something called the Dirichlet prior. To sort of judge how well the bias, how much bias it is introduced by each of these procedures, you look at cases where, say for example, here we don't have any cases that are less than 40 years old. But then in our conditional probability table, it is introduced that for whoever is less than 40 years old, all of them will need to be represented in the population, and therefore it shouldn't be a zero probability. And so it's just, in this situation, it will be an equal probability of all different categories among the BMI categories. And so this is the same effect, is what we call about doing a smoothing prior, what you would call. And then looking at the in terms of bias, you can check on your data set, say where, for example, there's other like unrepresented group, and which of these probability actually being introduced more. And so in our experience, we actually found out that the Bayesian Dirichlet equivalent uniform prior actually produces less amount of bias into the process. But this is also a really complicated sort of manipulating prior technique, because you sort of have to like specify whichever probabilities is in each individual cells, and therefore give the Bayesian network explicitly about the prior sort of likelihood for each individual combination. But yeah, that's just a time-related problem now. But therefore, this is what we call manipulating prior. I hope you understand. And then the other thing that we want to talk about is the validation of Bayesian network. As I mentioned before, is a really tricky process. So effectively, you cannot validate the structure of the Bayesian network. In many ways, you sort of need to use the literature support to sort of let yourself judge or whether the causal relationship between any two given variables are actually credible. And this you look at sort of empirical studies where there's say for example dose and effect response, or a repetition from many different groups receiving a similar type of findings, and this is how you judge the causal structure. And as for the estimation, for example, you can do it with the classic trend test split. But this is when, for example, you want to use Bayesian network as a classifiers. And so basically I tested I tested different type of models, and to see if they can classify cases into HCC yes and no, and how well they are. So in many ways, in the data set that I have, because there's an imbalance between the positive and the negative cases, and so my training data set was really not that great. And so therefore, when I tested on a different data set, the performance of the Bayesian network classification models actually performed really, really poorly, whichever way that was engineered. But yeah, so you can do trend test split on the estimations, which is the mathematical calculations for the posterior probabilities. But for the structures, you will need literature support or expert knowledge in it. And because of the sort of, in a situation where you want to look at counterfactuals, it's not possible to obtain counterfactual situations, because it is counterfactual, it's not factual cases. And so in many ways, you don't have the ground truth to test the estimation of the counterfactual reasoning. And so with causal effect reasoning, you would likely want to do something else, is to sort of refute against your assumptions, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later. So the idea is that because we cannot validate the estimation of the counterfactual effect, we want to be extra careful with our assumptions at the time when we're constructing a causal model, and therefore reduce whatever bias that is introduced to the system, and make sure that the model that we generate actually represent well to allow us to estimate counterfactual effect. So my true struggle is that you see that this like really, really bad performance of the training data. And this happens because I realized that adding a smoothing prior does not save you from sample size problem. And it also certainly does not save you from an imbalanced sample. And this is exactly what I had in our situation. I have like very, very few positive cases of people who had a confirmed liver cancer. And sometimes you will hear that people saying, no, Bayesian statistics doesn't get affected by sample sizes. But actually, the quality of parameter learning actually do get affected by sample sizes, because in a way, when you collect more and more information, you get more and more confident about the maximum likelihood of the situation that the world is likely going to represent. And so the quality of parameter learning do get affected by sample sizes, and this is a simple metric called the KL distance. So KL distance is basically calculating the distance between any two given distributions, and so basically we consider one distribution as the ground truth, and then the other one is the estimated one, and you want to reduce this KL distance between the two distributions. And with a larger number of data set, this distance will sort of decrease. And sort of like sample size is therefore a true struggle. So with sample size, what you can do is to utilize Bayes factor, which I will talk about here. So some people say Bayesian statistics is not affected by sample size. Well, indeed, it does. But there will be situations where it doesn't, because actually Bayes factor allows us to sort of judge whether we should be going favor or against null hypothesis. And remember, we'll talk about Bayes factor here. So in a situation where you can actually had both scenarios were of like favor of null hypothesis or favor of alternative hypothesis. But the reality is that you don't really know where your data set was set.